James Williams, black police chief, was driving home in his favorite car, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. No one imagined that in a few minutes he would have to fight for his life with his own subordinates, not for life but for death. What happens to him next will shock you. Do not miss this exciting story and watch until the end. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. James Williams, the first black police chief in his town, was driving home after a long and challenging day at the station. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, and the peaceful scenery around him provided a much-needed moment of relaxation. The road was quiet, framed by thick trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in warm shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the road. It felt good to be going home after such a tiring day. James's mind drifted to his responsibilities at the precinct. As chief of police, there were always challenges waiting for him. His position hadn't come easily. He had worked harder than most to earn the respect of both his officers and the community. But with that respect came expectations, and sometimes unspoken prejudices. Even now, after years of service, there were still those who doubted his authority simply because of his race. But he had learned to carry the weight of those expectations with pride and resilience. He was determined to prove every day that he belonged in this role. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, but James ignored it, focused on the calm of the road ahead. This drive, this quiet, was his moment of peace before he returned to his duties tomorrow. But, as serene as the evening felt, trouble was lurking just around the corner. Out of nowhere, a car sped past him, dangerously close to his front bumper. James's hands instinctively tightened on the wheel, and his heart skipped a beat as he swerved slightly to avoid a collision. The car zoomed ahead, weaving recklessly between lanes without any regard for safety. Anger surged through James's chest. He watched the vehicle dart ahead, its taillights flickering in the fading light. Whoever was behind the wheel was not only endangering themselves, but also everyone else on the road. This wasn't something he could ignore. His instincts kicked in, the officer in him taken over. Though he was off duty, he was still in uniform, having planned to stop by the station before heading home. His badge sat on the passenger seat next to him, a reminder of his role in maintaining order. With a determined look, James pressed his foot down on the accelerator, intending to catch up to the speeding car. The vehicle ahead continued its erratic swerving, and as James drew closer, he could see that this wasn't just a reckless driver. This was someone showing complete disregard for the law. His blood boiled at the sight. Years of fighting to uphold justice, and here was someone willing to throw it all away in a moment of carelessness. He flicked on his police lights, the blue and red flashing brightly in the growing darkness. The car in front slowed slightly, but instead of stopping, it jerked to the side of the road, skidding to a halt in the gravel. James pulled up behind them, his heart still racing from the near miss. He stepped out of his vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the car. As James neared the vehicle, the door swung open and two men stepped out. To his shock, they were both in uniform, police officers from his own department. For a moment, James was taken aback. These were men who should have known better, officers sworn to protect and serve, not to endanger lives. "What's your problem?" one of the officers barked, his tone aggressive as he stepped toward James. His partner followed, a menacing scowl plastered across his face. James remained calm, though the tension in the air was palpable. He could feel the situation escalating, and every instinct told him to keep things under control. "I could ask you the same question," James replied firmly, his voice steady. "You nearly caused an accident back there." The two officers exchanged a glance, and then they laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent a wave of irritation through James. "And who the hell do you think you are?" the first officer demanded, taking another step forward. James stood his ground, his gaze hardening as he looked between the two men. They didn't recognize him. They didn't care. He knew exactly where this was heading, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. To them, he was just another man, just another black man they thought they could intimidate. "I'm James Williams," he said, his tone firm but calm, "Chief of Police." For a moment, there was silence. The officers stared at him, their expressions frozen as they processed his words. For a brief second, it seemed like they might realize their mistake. But then one of them sneered. "Chief of Police, right," he scoffed, "and I'm the mayor." His tone was dripping with sarcasm, and the other officer chuckled in agreement. James's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the first time he had encountered disrespect, but the situation was quickly becoming dangerous. These officers weren't just dismissive, they were hostile. He had to be careful. "I suggest you calm down," James said, keeping his voice level. "You're making a big mistake." But they weren't listening. The second officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes flashing with aggression. "We don't take kindly to people like you trying to act like they're in charge," he spat, his words filled with venom. James's patience was running thin, but he refused to let them get to him. "People like me?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. He didn't need to hear the rest to know exactly what they meant. He had dealt with this kind of prejudice before. The first officer smirked, his eyes cold. "Yeah, people like you." Before James could respond, the first officer lunged at him, shoving him hard in the chest. The force of the attack sent him stumbling back, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. The second officer joined in, pushing him again, this time harder, sending him sprawling onto the gravel. James's mind raced. This wasn't just an altercation, this was an attack, and they didn't care who he was. In their eyes, he wasn't a man of authority. He wasn't their superior. He was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. As James struggled to stand, one of the officers kicked him in the ribs, sending a sharp pain shooting through his side. He gasped, clutching his ribs, but the assault continued. "You're going to regret messing with us," the officer snarled. James's vision blurred as the pain intensified. He had to get out of this. But as he tried to defend himself, another blow sent him crashing to the ground once again. This was only the beginning, and deep down, James knew it. The cold gravel pressed into James's back as he lay on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. Each shallow inhale sent sharp stabs of pain shooting through his ribs, the result of the brutal kick that had knocked the wind out of him moments earlier. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Two of his own officers, men who were supposed to uphold the law, had attacked him, and they didn't even care that he was the chief of police. Worse still, they didn't seem to care who he was at all. In their eyes, he was just another man they could brutalize with impunity. James groaned as he tried to roll over, but before he could even get to his knees, one of the officers, a tall, stocky man with a sneer etched permanently on his face, grabbed him by the collar and yanked him up roughly. The sudden movement sent another wave of pain through James's ribs, and he gasped, struggling to stay conscious. "Get up," the officer growled, his face mere inches from James's. His breath smelled of cigarettes and anger, the type of rage that could only come from a deep sense of hatred. "Think you're tough, huh? Think you can just pull us over and act like you're in charge?" James tried to respond, but before he could get a word out, the second officer, the one who had remained silent during most of the assault, stepped forward and punched him square in the stomach. The force of the blow doubled James over, and he gasped for air, clutching his abdomen as pain shot through his body like wildfire. "I told you, I'm the chief of police," James rasped, his voice barely audible as he fought to speak through the pain. He needed them to stop, to understand the gravity of their mistake before things escalated even further. But the words fell on deaf ears. The two officers laughed, exchanging a glance as if they couldn't believe the audacity of the man in front of them. The first officer, still gripping James's collar, shoved him hard again, sending him stumbling backward until he hit the side of his car. The impact jarred his already bruised ribs, and James gritted his teeth, fighting back the urge to cry out. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. This was personal. "Chief of Police," the first officer mocked, shaking his head as if it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. "Sure you are, and I'm the governor." The second officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he stared James down. There was a cruel, twisted satisfaction in his gaze, as if he enjoyed watching the pain and confusion on James's face. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're nothing but a punk who thinks he can tell us what to do." James clenched his fists, feeling the anger build inside him. He wanted to fight back, to defend himself, but he knew that any retaliation would only make things worse. He was outnumbered, and they were armed. But more than that, they were clearly intent on humiliating him, on teaching him a lesson they thought he deserved. To them, he was a nobody, a man who needed to be reminded of his place. Before he could think of his next move, the first officer's hand shot out, grabbing James's arm and twisting it behind his back with brutal force. A sickening crack echoed in the air, and James cried out as white-hot pain seared through his shoulder. His arm had been wrenched at an unnatural angle, and it felt as if it might snap at any moment. "Still think you're in charge?" the officer sneered, pressing harder, twisting James's arm even further until the pain became unbearable. James bit down on his lip, fighting back a scream. He could feel his arm giving way, the tendons and muscles straining under the pressure. He tried to pull away, but it was no use. The officer had him pinned, and with one final, brutal twist, James felt his arm break. The pain was blinding, a searing agony that seemed to consume every part of him. He collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming as he struggled to stay conscious. The officer released him, letting his broken arm fall limply at his side. James clutched his ribs with his good hand, gasping for breath as waves of pain radiated through his body. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Every nerve in his body screamed in agony. "Guess you won't be needing that arm anymore," the first officer said coldly, a smug grin spreading across his face as he stood over James's crumpled form. "Let that be a lesson for getting in our way." But they weren't done yet. The second officer turned his attention to James's car. It was still parked on the side of the road, its sleek black paint gleaming in the fading light. The car was James's pride and joy, a symbol of his hard work and success, something he had saved for years to buy, and now it was about to become the next victim of their twisted game. "Nice ride," the second officer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Would be a shame if something happened to it." James's heart sank as he watched the officer pull a lighter from his pocket, flicking it open with a grin. Panic surged through him, but he was powerless to stop what was coming next. His body was too weak, too broken, to do anything but watch as the officer approached the car's fuel tank. "Don't!" James gasped, his voice barely a whisper, but it was too late. With a flick of his wrist, the officer tossed the lighter onto the car, and within seconds, flames erupted from the vehicle. The fire spread quickly, engulfing the car in a raging inferno. Thick black smoke billowed into the air, and the heat from the flames seared James's skin even from where he lay. He watched in horror as his car, the car he had worked so hard to buy, was consumed by fire. It wasn't just a possession, it was a symbol of everything he had achieved, everything he had overcome. And now, in an instant, it was gone, reduced to ash by the very men who were supposed to protect him. The officers stood back, watching the blaze with satisfaction. "Looks like your ride's done for," one of them said, his voice full of mockery. James couldn't take his eyes off the flames. The heat was unbearable, the thick smoke stinging his lungs, but the pain in his chest, the emotional toll of watching everything he had built go up in flames, was far worse than anything physical. But even then, they weren't finished. The first officer walked over, grabbing James by the collar once again and pulling him to his feet. His legs were shaky, his body screaming in protest, but the officer didn't care. With a brutal shove, he threw James back onto the ground, his head hitting the gravel with a jarring thud. For a moment, everything went black. When James's vision cleared, he saw the second officer rifling through his pockets, pulling out his wallet and phone. "Thanks for the cash," the officer said with a smirk, waving the money in front of James's face. "Consider this a toll for messing with us." James could only watch as they took everything from him. His car, his money, his phone, his dignity. And then, without another word, they turned and walked back to their car, laughing as they drove off, leaving him lying battered and broken on the side of the road. "Next time, don't try to be a hero," one of them called out as they sped away, their taillights disappearing into the distance. James lay there in silence, his body aching from the beating, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. The heat from the burning car still radiated against his skin, and the sound of the crackling flames filled the air. He was alone, miles from town, with no way to call for help. But even in his pain, one thought burned brighter than the fire that consumed his car. This wasn't over. He would make it back. He would make sure those officers paid for what they had done. With every ounce of strength he had left, James forced himself to his feet, his broken arm hanging limply at his side. Each step sent waves of agony through his body, but he kept walking. He had no choice. His journey back to town had only just begun. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as James Williams stumbled along the dark, winding road. Each step was a battle, every breath a struggle against the pain that pulsed through his body like an unrelenting storm. His broken arm dangled uselessly at his side, the pain from the assault a constant reminder of what he had endured. His ribs ached with every shallow breath, and the cool night air stung his bruised skin. But despite everything, despite the agony and the exhaustion, James kept moving. The faint glow of the town's outskirts had finally come into view. The street lights, though dim and far away, were a beacon of hope, a promise that he wasn't far from help. His body was on the verge of collapse, but his mind clung to that distant light. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. His clothes were torn and dirty, streaked with blood and sweat, and his vision blurred with exhaustion as he trudged forward. Every few steps, his legs threatened to give out beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright. He had to reach the station. He had to make sure justice was served. When James finally stepped onto the first street of the town, his legs trembled, nearly buckling beneath him. But the familiar sight of the buildings around him gave him the strength to keep going. He was close now, just a few more blocks, and he would be at the police station, where his officers, his team, would help him make things right. As he neared the station, the pain in his ribs intensified, and his broken arm throbbed with every movement. His entire body screamed for rest, but James knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. The image of those two officers, laughing as they drove away, played over and over in his mind, fueling the anger that burned within him. They thought they had won. They thought they could get away with it. But they were wrong. Finally, the station came into view, a solid, familiar structure that represented everything James had worked so hard to build. He had poured his heart and soul into this department, earning the respect of his officers and the community alike. And now, two of his own had torn that trust apart. He staggered toward the entrance, his hand shaken as he reached for the door handle. The moment he stepped inside, all eyes turned to him. The officers at the front desk stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief at the sight of their battered chief. "Chief Williams," one of the officers, a young man named Officer Daniels, exclaimed, rushing toward him. "What happened?" James didn't answer right away. He was too focused on the task at hand. He pushed past the stunned faces, making his way toward his office at the back of the building. Every step felt like torture, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let his injuries take him down, not until justice was served. "I need every available officer," James rasped as he passed the front desk. His voice was hoarse, strained from the pain, but his words carried the authority of a man who wouldn't be stopped. Now. The officers scrambled to follow his orders, their shock quickly giving way to action as they rushed to mobilize. James's reputation as a strong, decisive leader had earned him the loyalty of his team, and tonight they would prove that loyalty. By the time James reached his office, the adrenaline that had fueled him for so long was starting to fade, leaving behind only the searing pain in his broken arm and bruised ribs. He collapsed into his chair, gasping for breath as the weight of the night's events pressed heavily on him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But he couldn't allow that. Not yet. The door to his office burst open, and Lieutenant Andrew Smith, one of James's most trusted officers, rushed in. His face was tight with concern, his eyes scanning the injuries that covered James's body. "Chief, what the hell happened?" Andrew asked, his voice laced with panic. "You look like you've been through a war." "I was attacked," James replied, his tone cold and controlled. He straightened up in his chair, fighting through the pain. "By two of our own." The shock on Andrew's face was unmistakable. "What?" he asked, disbelief clear in his voice. "Who? How?" "They thought they could get away with it," James continued, cutting him off. "They didn't recognize me. They didn't care. To them, I was just another black man who needed to be put in his place." The room fell silent as the weight of James's words sank in. Andrew's face hardened, and he nodded slowly, his jaw clenched in anger. "We'll find them," he said, his voice steady. "I'll mobilize the entire force if I have to." James nodded, grateful for Andrew's loyalty, but the rage inside him still simmered. This wasn't just about the two officers who had attacked him. This was about the system they represented, the deep-seated prejudice that had allowed them to believe they could get away with what they had done. And James wasn't going to let that stand. "Send out every available unit," James ordered, his voice firm. "I want those men found and brought in, now." Andrew didn't hesitate. He immediately began relaying the order over his radio, his voice crackling through the station as he organized the manhunt. Officers were deployed to comb through the town, searching for any sign of the two men responsible. The entire department was mobilized within minutes, and the station buzzed with the sound of officers preparing for the operation. But James wasn't content to sit idly by while his men did the work. He had to be there. He had to see this through. Ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs, James pushed himself to his feet, reaching for his jacket with his good hand. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he steadied himself against the desk, determined not to show weakness in front of his officers. "Sir," Andrew began cautiously, his brow furrowing as he watched James struggle to stand. "You should rest. You're hurt badly. Let us handle this." But James shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm going," he said, leaving no room for debate. "I'm not sitting this one out." Andrew opened his mouth to argue, but then thought better of it. He knew better than to challenge James when he had that look in his eyes, the look of a man who had made up his mind. "All right," Andrew said with a nod. "I'll drive." Together, they made their way out of the station, the other officers watching with a mix of admiration and concern as their chief limped toward the patrol car. They knew the severity of his injuries, but they also knew that nothing was going to stop James Williams from bringing those men to justice. The drive through town was tense, the radio crackling with updates as officers scoured the streets and surrounding areas. Patrol cars were dispatched to every major road and checkpoint, and the search widened with each passing minute. James kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind racing with thoughts of the men who had attacked him. He could still see their smug expressions, their sneering faces as they kicked him to the ground and laughed at his pain. They had underestimated him. They thought they could brutalize him and walk away unscathed, but they were wrong. As the patrol car sped toward the outskirts of town, the tension in the air thickened. James's heart pounded in his chest, both from the pain and the anticipation. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was laser-focused on one thing: finding those men and making sure they faced the consequences of their actions. Finally, the call came through. "Chief, we've got a lead," came the voice of Officer Johnson over the radio. Two men matching the description were seen heading toward the old service road near Route 25. James's pulse quickened. He knew that road. It was a secluded stretch that ran parallel to the highway, hidden by dense forest on either side. It was the perfect place to try and make an escape, but it was also the perfect place to corner them. "Send units there immediately," James ordered, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to catch them." Andrew glanced at him, concern still etched on his face, but James didn't waver. His mind was made up. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. As they approached the turnoff to the service road, James's heart pounded harder. The flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the dark path ahead, and officers were already moving into position, closing in on the suspects. James's body screamed with pain, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't going to stop now. He wasn't going to rest until those men were caught. The hunt was on. James stepped out of the patrol car, wincing as pain shot through his ribs and his broken arm throbbed with every movement. The flashing lights from the other patrol cars cast long, eerie shadows across the narrow service road, illuminating the thick trees that lined both sides. Officers were already moving into position, fanning out into the dark forest where the two rogue officers had been spotted. James's heart pounded in his chest, his body screaming for rest, but his mind was sharp, focused entirely on what needed to be done. Lieutenant Andrew Smith approached him, his face tight with determination, but his eyes filled with concern for his chief. "We've got them pinned down about half a mile into the woods," Andrew reported, his voice low but urgent. "They tried to run for it, but we've got them surrounded." James nodded, clenching his jaw to push down the pain. "Good," he muttered, his tone hard. "I want to be there when they're brought in." Andrew hesitated, clearly torn between his concern for James's well-being and his respect for the chief's authority. "Sir, maybe you should let us handle this. You're injured and—" "I'm going," James interrupted, his voice steely and leaving no room for argument. "I need to see this through." Andrew gave a reluctant nod, understanding that there was no point in trying to change his mind. Together, they headed toward the woods, following the other officers who were moving cautiously between the trees, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches, felt amplified in the tense silence. The air was thick with anticipation, and James's pulse quickened with each step, the adrenaline keeping him moving despite the agony in his body. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the light from the patrol cars faded behind them, leaving only the dim glow of the flashlights to guide their way. James's mind raced, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He could still see the faces of the two men who had attacked him, the smug satisfaction as they kicked him while he lay helpless on the ground, their sneers as they set his car on fire. They thought they could get away with it. They thought they could brutalize him and walk away without consequence. But they were about to learn how wrong they were. After what felt like an eternity, the group reached a small clearing. There, huddled together in the shadows of the trees, were the two men, Mike Sanders and Paul Roberts. Their uniforms were dirty, their faces pale with fear, a far cry from the arrogant confidence they had displayed earlier in the night. They had nowhere left to run. Several officers had their guns trained on them, ready for any sudden movement, but the two men made no attempt to resist. They knew they were caught. James stepped forward, his gaze locked on the two officers. His body ached with every movement, his ribs screaming with each shallow breath, but he pushed the pain aside. All he could focus on was the two men who had nearly killed him. Mike Sanders, the taller of the two, looked up first, his eyes widening in recognition as he finally realized who was standing before him. Fear flashed across his face, and he swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling as the weight of his actions hit him. Paul Roberts, the more aggressive of the two, looked equally shaken, though he kept his head down, avoiding James's gaze. "You thought you could get away with this," James said, his voice low and dangerous, the anger he had held back all night now seeping into every word. "You thought you could leave me for dead, and no one would ever know." Sanders opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at Roberts, who remained silent, his face pale and his body trembling. They both knew what was coming. They had expected to intimidate a random civilian on the road, but now they were staring down the very man they had sworn to serve under, the man they had beaten and humiliated. "You're going to regret every second of what you did tonight," James continued, taking a step closer. His eyes burned with fury, but his voice remained steady, controlled. He wasn't just speaking as a victim. He was speaking as their chief. The silence that followed was heavy, the tension palpable as James stared down the two men who had betrayed everything they were supposed to stand for. "Take them in," James ordered, his voice sharp as steel. The officers moved quickly, stepping forward to cuff Sanders and Roberts. The two men didn't resist as their hands were yanked behind their backs and the cold metal cuffs snapped around their wrists. The arrogance they had displayed earlier in the night was gone, replaced by a crushing realization that their careers and their freedom were over. James watched as they were led out of the woods and back toward the patrol cars, their heads hung low in defeat. He didn't feel satisfaction, not yet. There was still too much anger, too much pain. This wasn't over. Back at the station, James sat behind his desk, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been clawing at him all night. Every inch of him hurt. His broken arm throbbed, his ribs ached with every breath, and his head pounded from the constant tension. But the pain that burned most fiercely was the anger still simmering inside him. Across from him, Andrew stood with a look of deep concern. "Chief, you need to go to the hospital. You're in no shape to keep pushing yourself like this." "I'll go when I'm ready," James replied, his voice hoarse but resolute. He leaned back in his chair, wincing as his ribs protested the movement. "Not until this is done." Andrew sighed, clearly frustrated, but he didn't push the issue. Instead, he gave a respectful nod and moved toward the door. "We've got them both in holding cells. They're not saying much, but I doubt it'll matter. There's more than enough evidence against them." James nodded, though the satisfaction that should have come with those words was absent. "Good. They'll face justice for what they did." Andrew lingered by the door for a moment, clearly torn. "And you, Chief? You've been through hell tonight. You need to rest. Let us handle the rest from here." James closed his eyes, letting out a long breath as the weight of everything settled on his shoulders. "I'll rest when this is over," he muttered. "Not before." The door clicked shut as Andrew left the office, leaving James alone with his thoughts. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as he sat in silence. The events of the night replayed in his mind, every punch, every kick, the fire that had consumed his car, all of it still fresh, still raw. He had been through a lot in his career, but this, being attacked by his own men who were supposed to uphold the law, was something else entirely. It cut deeper than any wound, leaving a scar that would take a long time to heal. But James wasn't broken. He was hurt, yes, physically and emotionally, but he wasn't defeated. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. Tomorrow he would implement changes. The department needed to be better, and it started with him. He would overhaul the training, ensuring that every officer understood what it meant to serve and protect. Not just some, but all. And anyone who didn't take that seriously would be gone. But for tonight, all he could do was sit in the quiet and let the pain settle. His body screamed for rest, his mind begged for peace, but the battle was far from over. The two men who had attacked him were disgraced, but the system that allowed them to believe they could act without consequence still needed to be reformed. Justice had been served, but there was so much more work to be done. James would rest, but only after the changes had been made. Only after he could ensure that this would never happen again. Not to him, not to anyone. As the clock ticked on and the night deepened, James Williams, battered but unbroken, knew that this fight was far from over. The battle for justice had only just begun. If this story moved you, make sure to give it a thumbs up, Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us create content that matters. And if you're ready for more, check out our other videos. Just click on the links and dive into more gripping tales. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.